November, 1878. The first real cold of the season had arrived, and it had teeth. Abigail stood on the porch of the home that was no longer hers, her hands empty except for the worn leather leash of her dog, Kaiser. A thin wool shawl over a faded calico dress was all she had against a wind that carried the promise of ice. The cold seeped through the worn soles of her boots, a quiet thief stealing what little warmth she had left. Her brother-in-law, Bartholomew, filled the doorway, his body a barricade against her past. He would not meet her eyes. He looked at the grey, unforgiving sky over her shoulder as he spoke. "The deed is in my name now, Abigail," he said, the words flat, rehearsed. "The law is the law. There is no room for a widow and a mouth that does not earn its keep." She did not answer. There was nothing to say. She had known this was coming. She turned away from the only home she had known for 10 years, her face toward the granite peaks that loomed over the valley. She and Kaiser walked off the porch, the dog's gait slow and deliberate as if he understood the finality of the moment. They walked past the barn, past the fallow fields, toward the solid face of the mountain, a place no one ever went. She was looking for something her husband had mentioned once, in passing, a story dismissed by everyone else as a prospector's fancy. A fissure in the rock, no wider than a man's shoulders, that breathed warm air even in the deepest winter. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. Abigail was a listener. In a world where women's voices were meant for quilting circles and church socials, she had found her education in the conversations of men she was not meant to overhear. While other women traded recipes for preserves, Abigail learned the language of the earth. Her husband, Samuel, had been a quiet man, a prospector before a failed claim had turned him into a farmer. He never lost his first love. He spoke of the land not as dirt to be tilled, but as a book to be read, its history written in layers of stone and sediment. Abigail had read that book over his shoulder for a decade. She learned to identify limestone not by its color but by its chalky feel under her thumbnail. She could spot a vein of shale by the way it fractured into thin, sharp layers. She knew that the deep purple flowers of the loca weed, a danger to cattle, also meant that water ran deep and constant somewhere below the surface. She learned that the mountains were not solid things, but porous, filled with voids and passages, a secret architecture hidden from the sun. This was not knowledge the world valued in a woman. It was seen as peculiar, even unnatural. Bartholomew's wife saw her quiet observation as a form of idleness, her questions about geology as an unsettling intrusion into the domain of men. It was not a wife's place to know the bones of the earth. Her place was to tend the hearth, to mend the clothes, to bear the children she had failed to produce. Her barrenness was a quiet sin, a daily reminder of her failure to fulfill her primary purpose. Samuel's death from a sudden fever the previous spring had removed her only protector, the only person who saw her curiosity not as a flaw but as a form of intelligence. Without him, she was just a barren widow occupying a useful chair, a constant, silent reproach in a house struggling to survive. The community reinforced this verdict in 1,000 small ways. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was as sharp as a needle, had once cornered her at a church social. "A woman's mind should be a quiet garden, Abigail," she'd said, her voice laced with false sweetness, not a quarry of the line stung because it was so precise. They saw her interest as a kind of destruction, a digging into things that should be left sealed and silent. Samuel's death had sealed her fate. The deed to the farm, as was the custom and the law, passed not to his wife but to his eldest brother. For a season, they had tolerated her presence, a charity offered with heavy sighs and pointed remarks about the cost of flour. But the summer's harvest was thin, and the coming winter promised to be harder than most. Her grief was a resource they could not afford to indulge. Bartholomew's words on the porch were not the beginning of her exile. They were just the final sentence of a verdict that had been written the day Samuel's heart stopped beating. She and Kaiser walked away not from a home, but from a house where she had already become a ghost. She did not look back. The past was a locked door, and the only key she had ever possessed was now buried in the churchyard. The first days were a lesson in the indifference of nature. The wind was a constant, physical pressure, seeking out every gap in her clothing. She and Kaiser found temporary shelter in a shallow rock overhang, but it offered little protection from the relentless cold. The temperature dropped with the sun, and the cold became a presence, a weight in the air that worked its way through wool and flesh and into her bones. Her fingers, exposed as she gathered bits of dry brush for a pitifully small fire, went from burning to aching to a terrifying numbness. She stopped being able to feel them at all. Shivering, at first a violent, uncontrollable tremor, eventually subsided into a low, constant hum, a sign her body was losing its fight to generate heat. She had a small parcel of bread and jerky wrapped in a cloth inside her apron, a theft she did not regret. She rationed it with grim precision. A sliver of jerky for her, a sliver for Kaiser. A corner of bread, chewed slowly to make it last. It was not enough. By the second day, a persistent dizziness had set in. Standing up too quickly made the world tilt and fade to grey at the edges. She had to crawl the 20 yards to the frozen creek, using a sharp rock to break a hole in the ice for water that was so cold it made her teeth ache. The dog was her only source of warmth. Kaiser, a magnificent German shepherd Samuel had raised from a pup, seemed to understand. He lay pressed against her back, a living furnace, a warm, breathing weight that was the only thing keeping the deepest, final chill at bay. He did not complain. He watched her with intelligent, worried eyes. On the third night, she considered giving up. She lay in the dark, curled into the tightest possible ball, Kaiser a warm curve at her spine. The sky was clear, and the stars were hard, distant points of light, glittering like chips of ice. They offered no comfort. She thought of the warm kitchen she had been thrown out of. She could almost smell the simmering stew on the stove, feel the radiant heat on her face. It would be so easy to go back. To knock on the door. To beg. To offer to work as a servant in the home that should have been hers. The thought was a brief, seductive warmth in the frozen landscape of her mind. Or she could just lie still. She could stop fighting. She could let the cold do its work. It would be a quiet end to a quiet, unsatisfactory life. Something pulled her back. It was not a vision, not a prayer answered. It was the dog. Kaiser whined, a low, guttural sound deep in his chest. He shifted his weight and nudged her numb hand with his cold, wet nose. It was a simple, animal demand. He needed her to get up. He was thirsty. He was loyal. He would not leave her, and his presence was a responsibility she could not shed, even in the face of her own despair. And then, a sentence of Samuel's drifted back to her, unbidden. They had been walking this very line at the base of the mountain years ago. The mountain breathes, he had said, placing his palm against the granite. In the winter, you can feel it. Find the place it breathes from, and you'll find shelter from any storm. It was not a miracle. It was a memory. It was a practical problem that demanded a solution. Find the breath. The next day, she searched. She forced her protesting muscles to move, her body stiff and clumsy with cold. She moved along the base of the granite cliff face, her bare hand trailing against the cold, rough stone. She was looking for what Samuel had described, a fissure, easily missed, partially hidden. She walked for hours, her hope dwindling with the daylight. She almost walked past it. A crack, no wider than her shoulders, nearly invisible behind a thicket of gnarled, hardy winter brush. She would have missed it entirely if not for Kaiser, who stopped and pushed his nose into the thicket, sniffing intently. She pushed the brittle branches aside. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air drifted from the opening. It was not warm, not like the breath from a living thing. But it was not the biting, hostile cold of the outside air. It was the steady, neutral temperature of the deep earth, a constant 55 degrees, season after season. This was it. She had to force herself into the opening, turning sideways, her small satchel scraping against one wall, her shoulder pressing hard against the other. The rock was cold and unforgiving. It was dark, a profound and absolute blackness unlike the darkness of night. It smelled of damp stone, of minerals, and of something else, something ancient and clean, like the smell of the first rain on a desert floor. For what felt like an eternity, she shuffled forward, one hand on Kaiser's back for guidance, the other held out in front of her, brushing against the unyielding wall. The passage was straight, a narrow channel carved through the heart of the mountain. It went on for 40 feet. Then, the wall beside her fell away. The oppressive closeness vanished. The darkness became vast, oceanic. She fumbled in her satchel for the single tallow candle and the tin of matches she had taken. Her fingers were clumsy, numb, but she managed to strike a match. The flame sputtered, then caught, a tiny, brave point of light in the immense black. She lifted the candle. The flame steadied, then rose, pulled by a gentle draft. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing a space that made no sense, a place that should not exist. A cavern. Not a small cave, but a vast, vaulted chamber, the ceiling lost in the high darkness far above. The walls were smooth, pale limestone, streaked with veins of calcite that glittered in the candlelight like 1,000 frozen waterfalls. The air was still and cool, but not cold. It was utterly silent. She did not feel relief. She did not feel joy. The emotions were too small for the space. She dropped to her knees on the cool, dusty floor. Kaiser circled her once, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the stone, then sat, pressing his body against hers. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of recognition. This was the place Samuel had been looking for. This was the quarry her mind was suited for. This was right. Her first task was fire. The cavern offered shelter, but she needed warmth to survive. There was no wood, not a single stick. But her memory served her. Samuel's talk of the land. She remembered him describing oil shale, a dark, lead rock that could burn with a slow, steady heat. She took her candle and explored the back of the great chamber. Following a dark seam in the limestone, she found it. A wall of dark grey, almost black rock, oily to the touch, that broke away in flat, heavy pieces. The next problem was smoke. A fire without a chimney would fill the cavern with suffocating fumes. She looked up, following the slow, almost imperceptible drift of the air. High above, she could just make out a dark opening in the vaulted ceiling, the fissure that was the mountain's lung. Directly beneath it, a natural alcove was set into the cavern wall. It was a perfect fireplace, designed by geology and time. She began to build. Using flat stones gathered from the floor, she constructed a hearth. For mortar, she found a seep where water dripped constantly, creating a deposit of thick, pliable clay. It was slow, painstaking work. Her hands, still partially numb, were clumsy. She dropped stones, smeared clay, started over. Finally, she had a rough but solid hearth and the beginnings of a flue, directing the smoke toward the high fissure. She chipped off pieces of the oil shale with the sharp edge of a rock. She arranged them carefully on the hearth, using the last of her dry tinder to start a flame. The first fire was a disappointment. It was smoky, sullen, the fumes filling the alcove and spilling out into the cavern. She smothered it, adjusted the stones of the flue, and tried again. And again. On the fourth try, it worked. The flame caught, the shale began to glow with a deep red heat, and the smoke rose in a clean, steady column, drawn upward and disappearing into the high darkness. The fire did not crackle like wood. It hissed, a soft, constant sound, and it gave off a dry, mineral heat that began to push back the cavern's deep chill. She needed tools. She had almost nothing. But she remembered another of Samuel's stories. A failed silver claim, a mile east along the mountain's base, abandoned decades ago. She left the relative safety of the cave and searched for it. The miners had left behind their failures. She found a cracked cast iron pot, rusted through in one spot, but it would hold water if she was careful. She found a discarded pickaxe head, heavy and blunt, which she later lashed to a sturdy branch with leather strips cut from her own boots. These became her primary tools. With the pickaxe, she could break the shale more easily. With the pot, she could boil water from the deep, clear spring she discovered in a side chamber, a pool of water so pure it tasted sweet. Slowly, methodically, she built a life. She walled off a small section of the cavern near the fire with stones piled high, creating a sleeping chamber that would hold the heat. For a bed, she made dozens of trips outside, gathering dry grasses and pine boughs, creating a thick, fragrant mattress that kept her off the cold stone floor. She discovered a second, smaller chamber, connected to the main one by a low passage. The air inside it was constant, cool and dry, a natural larder. Here, she began to store what little she had. But she needed more than survival. She needed a future. She needed a source of food that would not run out. She made a decision that felt like madness. She took the last valuable thing she owned, a small silver locket with a portrait of her mother, and walked the 2 days to the next settlement, a small town where she was not known. She traded the locket for 3 scrawny laying hens and a young rooster. Getting them back to the mountain was an ordeal, carrying the squawking, protesting birds in a makeshift sack. Bringing them into the silent, stone world of the cave felt like a profanity, a violation. But life required life. She built them a coop in a small alcove, using salvaged planks from the miners' camp. The greatest challenge was the light. Chickens needed light to lay. She found the solution deep in the cave, patches of phosphorescent moss that gave off a faint, ethereal green glow. She carefully transplanted it, lining the walls of their enclosure. It was a ghostly, underwater light, but it was light. She foraged for them constantly, gathering insects, grubs, and seeds on her forays outside. And against all logic, they thrived. They scratched in the dirt floor she had made for them. They drank from a small stone basin she filled with spring water. And one morning, she found it. A perfect, pale brown egg. She held it in her palm, the shell still warm. It was not just an egg. It was a promise. The sound of their clucking, a mundane, domestic noise, became the heartbeat of her new world. The first true proof of her success came in the dead of winter, in January. Outside, the world was locked in ice and snow. Inside, in the constant, gentle warmth of her shale fire, she decided to make a garden. She found the miner's abandoned or cart, rusted but solid. Over the course of a week, she hauled it into the cavern and filled it, sack by sack, with rich soil from a sheltered spot near the creek. In her pockets, she still had a few seeds from her garden back at the farm, saved from the previous harvest. Radishes. Lettuce. She planted them in the dark earth of the ore cart, watering them carefully. She had no real hope they would grow. But they did. First, tiny, pale green shoots pushed through the soil. They grew slowly, reaching for the faint light of the fire. When she pulled the first radish, it was small and almost white, not the robust red it should have been. But it was real. She washed it in the spring and ate it whole. The sharp, peppery crunch was the most beautiful taste she had ever known. It was the taste of a thing that should not exist, a defiant act of life in a world of stone and darkness. An ally appeared. Not a savior, but an observer. An old Ute woman, known to the townspeople only as walks alone, sometimes foraged for roots and herbs at the base of the mountain. The town dismissed her as a relic of a bygone era. She was the one person who noticed the faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke that rose from the high fissure in the mountain face. She was not alarmed. She was curious. One afternoon, as Abigail emerged from the crack to gather shale, she found the old woman waiting. She was sitting on a rock, perfectly still. She did not speak. She simply held out a handful of dried, fragrant herbs. Abigail paused, then took them. She went back inside and returned with a fresh egg, which she offered in return. The old woman accepted it with a slight nod. This was how their friendship began. It was a relationship built on silent exchange and mutual respect. The woman, whose real name Abigail never learned, taught her things Samuel never knew. She showed her, without many words, which roots were edible when boiled, how to read the subtle signs of animal tracks in the snow, how to find pockets of wild salt crusted on the rock faces. She recognized in Abigail a similar quietness, a way of listening to what the land had to say. She saw the cave not as an unnatural tomb, but as a logical extension of the mountain's shelter. She saw the impossible garden and the impossible chickens and simply nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The town had assumed Abigail was dead, another soul claimed by the harshness of the wilderness. Then, during a brief January thaw, the storekeeper, a pragmatic man named Henderson, was tracking a deer and found her tracks. They were small, clear, and led directly to the granite face of the mountain, where they simply vanished. He was baffled. He called out her name. There was no answer. Weeks later, needing salt and thread, Abigail walked into his store. She was thin, her face weathered, but she was undeniably alive. Kaiser stood at her side, watchful and silent. She placed 3 perfect, winter-laid eggs on the counter. "I would like to trade for a bag of salt," she said. Henderson stared at the eggs, then at her. He knew his own hens had stopped laying weeks ago. He made the trade without a word. But he told people. The story spread, warped by fear and superstition. The preacher warned from his pulpit about unnatural things that grew in darkness, about a woman living outside the grace of God and community. They were suspicious. They were afraid. But the winter was long and hard, and their own larders were dwindling. Hunger is a more powerful force than superstition. The Miller family, their youngest child sick and thin, was the first to seek her out. They did not dare approach the crack in the rock. They waited at the base of the mountain, a small, desperate huddle in the cold. Abigail came down to them. She gave them a dozen eggs and a bundle of dried herbs the old Ute woman had given her. She asked for nothing in return. They came back the next week, and this time they brought a sack of flour to trade. In late February, a blizzard descended upon the valley. It was not a normal storm. It was a solid wall of white, a furious, shrieking wind that erased the world. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30. The wind drove the snow into mountainous drifts that buried houses to their eaves and collapsed the roofs of barns. People were trapped. Their firewood, stacked for a normal winter, ran low. Their food was scarce. The cold was no longer just a condition, it was a predator, seeping through the walls, relentless and lethal. A figure appeared at the mouth of the crack in the rock, a ghost stumbling out of the white maelstrom, half frozen and covered in snow. It was Bartholomew. He was smaller than she remembered. The rigid certainty had gone out of him, replaced by a desperate exhaustion. His face was gaunt, his beard a solid mass of ice. This was not the man who had stood in the farmhouse doorway, citing the law. This was just a cold man, lost and afraid. He fell to his knees before he could speak. Kaiser growled, a low rumble in his chest, but Abigail quieted him with a hand on his head. She helped her brother-in-law into the passage and led him into the vast, warm cavern. He told her the town was freezing. The miller's roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The preacher's family was burning their furniture to stay warm. They were running out of time. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not have the strength. He asked for help. Abigail looked at the man who had cast her out into the cold that was now consuming him. She did not see an enemy. She did not feel the hot flush of victory or the cold satisfaction of revenge. She saw a logistical problem. She saw human beings in need. She turned from Bartholomew and began to gather blankets. "How many people?" she asked. She did not gloat. She did not demand an apology. She helped. She guided Bartholomew back down the treacherous mountain path, Kaiser breaking the trail through the deep, drifting snow. One by one, she brought them up. The preacher and his wife, Mrs. Gable, their faces masks of disbelief and shame. The Miller family, their children wrapped in every blanket they owned. Henderson, the storekeeper. 10 people in all, a small, frozen congregation of her former neighbors. She led them to the crack in the rock and showed them how to enter sideways, one at a time. They emerged from the narrow passage into the great cavern, into the soft glow of the shale fire, the smell of roasting venison, the impossible, life-affirming sound of chickens clucking in the dark. They stared at the ordered, thriving world she had built from nothing. They stood in her cathedral of stone and survival, and they were silent. For 3 days, they lived in her world. She fed them from her stores. Hot broth made from chicken bones and wild roots. Smoked venison, a gift from walks alone. The pale, crisp lettuce from her garden box, a miracle on a plate. They ate her food. They warmed themselves by her fire. They slept on the beds of pine boughs she prepared for them. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. The wind died, and a weak sun appeared. As they prepared to leave, Bartholomew approached her. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he was wrong. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a language he could not speak, then turned and left without a word. After they were all gone, she unfolded the paper. It was the deed to the farm. His signature was at the bottom of the transfer section, legally assigning it to her. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement, a practical restitution. It had cost him the only thing he had of value. As Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, was about to leave, she paused. She looked at the small, thriving garden in the orchard, the pale green life pushing up from the dark soil. "It is not a quarry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a root cellar." Abigail simply nodded. It was the closest to understanding she would ever receive from them, and it was enough. Abigail never returned to the farmhouse. She had the deed, but the house was no longer her home. The mountain was her home. In time, the townspeople learned to come to her, not for salvation, but for trade and knowledge. Eggs in winter. Herbs that could break a fever. She taught the miller boy how to find the flammable shale and how to build a clean burning stove. She showed Walks Alone's granddaughter, who had her grandmother's quiet way of seeing, how to cultivate the phosphorescent moss. She lived for another 30 years, a quiet, respected fixture of the mountain. She died in her chair one autumn evening, a wool blanket over her lap, the shale fire burning low and steady. The air in the cavern was warm and still. A basket of seeds for the next spring's planting sat on the table beside her. Her face, in repose, looked like that of a person who has just finished a long and satisfying book. They found her a week later, Kaiser lying at her feet, his old grey head on her knee. He had refused to leave her side. They buried her on a small rise near the entrance to her home. Her work endured. The miller boy, using the principles she had taught him, designed a heating system for the town's small schoolhouse, using shale oil to keep it warm through the brutal winter of 1912. Walks Alone's granddaughter became a renowned healer, using the unique plants and herbs that grew only in the mountain's sheltered ecosystem. The town never starved through a hard winter again. They stopped calling it the fissure or the cave. They called it Abigail's Pantry's. Her headstone, carved by Henderson's son, had only one sentence. It read, "She fed people. You have a place like this inside you. A sealed door you were told never to open. A gift you were told was a flaw. A quietness the world mistook for emptiness. You stand outside of it, in the cold, believing the voices that told you there was no room for what you are. But the mountain breathes. The door is no wider than your shoulders. You have to turn sideways to get in. But inside is a cathedral you were meant to build. That fissure in the rock, that breathed warm air, was not an escape. It was an invitation. The world will tell you what you are. A quiet life is spent showing the world it was wrong. We tell more stories about the quiet magnificent. Subscribe to see who we find next.